My guest today is Olivier Blanchard, professor of economics at MIT and a top macroeconomist. He was the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund during the sovereign debt crisis, and today he heads the expert commission that will advise President Macron on how to design the post-COVID economy.
Merci, Olivier. It's really great to have you here. Thanks for dedicating some of your time to explaining and to giving us your insights. Let's start from the more general overview of where things are right now. How do you see, what's the landscape? How do you see things evolving right now? What's your sense of where we are at this moment?
So I think where we are depends on where you are, whether you're in the US or in Europe. But I think there are commonalities. I mean, it's really important to understand that the slump was a policy decision, was based on very good reasons for health purposes, but it was a policy-induced decision. And so I think that's very important to remember. So the worst was at the beginning when we basically had lockdown. And I'm fairly confident that from then on, it just goes up. The question is at what speed? And there I see three phases. The first one is in the very short run. The very fact that you end lockdown and you allow firms to start again, even not at full speed, but just start, you're going to get a mechanical effect, which is you're going to basically make up part of the fall. How much is difficult to know. My sense is in countries like most European countries, where the virus is more or less under control, you can basically make up about 2/3 of the fall. In the US, where things are not so good, and people are going to continue to do physical distancing, not going to go to the office because they are scared and so on. I don't think we'll see a lockdown, but we'll see something like it. And then it could be that we only do half up rather than 2/3. That's, I think, for the next few months. Then you have this period between the end of this one and the vaccine, as a metaphor, but the time when basically we can stop physical distancing, restaurants can go back to the way they do business, people take planes without thinking too hard, and so on and so on. And during that period, it's going to be much slower because many sectors are going to be affected by it in a fairly strong way. And if you don't do anything, we'll come back to it, I know, but if you don't do anything, this would be a very tough period for a large number of firms, a large number of workers. Then the vaccine comes, right, which is hopefully sometime next year. And then we have kind of the long run changes, the reallocation. And we don't have a good sense of how big it's going to be. Is it going to be the type of reallocation we always see, or something much worse, in which case you might have structural unemployment for quite a while? So basically the message is optimistic, but I think I'm worried that people are going to see the numbers in the short run and think, oh, things are just fine. In fact, yes, for a while, we're going to go up fairly fast. After this, it's going to be much more difficult.
In a way, for a short run, things are going to go better than people fear. They're going to be happy. And in the medium run, people might go worse than people then hope, in some sense. Is that how you see it?
Yes.
I'm
slightly worried about the optimism leading people and maybe governments not to do the right thing, because it's the V, the old story about the shape of the up, the down and up. It starts like a V, but very quickly I think it turns into some much more horizontal portion, and if we're not careful, the horizontal portion could be long and bad.
And the sign you're drawing, the sign of the square root with the E just in the middle, that's the one that kind of starts fine, but then slows down and basically leaves things stable, stationary for a while. Do you fear kind of a W, meaning we are all happy or things are getting better, and then suddenly we really need to go all the way back to the start because lockdowns, etc., come back? Or do you think lockdowns might just be a thing of the past, more likely?
There's positive probability on anything at this stage, but I put very low probability, even in the US. My sense is it's going to be very tough in the US. And again, what we've learned is that the lockdown itself, as a legal decision, has only a marginal effect. I mean, if people are scared, they just don't go to work, right? So there might be some of it. A formal lockdown, I suspect things would have to be catastrophic for governments to do it again. And it may be that in retrospect, when we actually look with information we have and we shall have, maybe the lockdown was too strong. Maybe there was a way of doing it with slightly less economic cost. Now, that's not a criticism of what was done, because the precautionary principle was of the essence. Do too much, if anything, right? But it may be that it turned out to be more costly and more psychologically costly and maybe more politically costly than we anticipated. And so I think even the US government, even if things go very bad, will be very reluctant. So I think what we'll see in the US is a lot of deaths and growth, some growth. That's the bet. The risk is that the number of deaths increases so much that they have to do more. But it's a very cynical assessment, but I think that's the most likely outcome.
That's the most likely. Now, Olivier, one thing that you were just hinting about the longer run reaction, it's very hard to tell now. Are we going to see permanent changes in the composition of demand, the way the economy works, even after a vaccine? One thing that does seem possible is that as machines don't get virus and are not exposed to anemia, the virus could accelerate the substitution of labor by capital and making the robotization and all these trends even more faster, accelerating these trends. Is this what you would expect? I mean, it's hard to tell at this point, but would you expect?
No, this would be fairly low on my list. And here, let me make a related point, which is we're facing two types of shocks looking forward. The ones which are due to the presence of the virus at some fairly high level of intensity. These will likely go away when the vaccine is there. Again, think of restaurants. They are clearly facing a very different environment now, but 2 years from now, the reasonable assumption is that they'll look exactly like last year, right? And that's true of many activities. So I think you have to think of this. Then you have to think of what we would call the hysteritic effects of that, which we've learned to do things differently. We've learned about different risks, and these will have longer run effects, right? So telecommuting and all its implications is kind of the quintessential example of that. Shifting to robots because next year the virus is still there, or there is one chance out of 100 that it happens again in the next 20 years. Seems, if I were a firm, I might well shift to robots, but not because of that. It seems to me that's second order.
I was thinking, for example, of the cashier in a supermarket, right? You take out the cashier. You were thinking of taking out the cashier. The self-checking takes.
It was already happening. I mean, I think where it was happening, this, is just one epsilon more, which makes you do it. And maybe indeed for cashiers, it happens faster. But I think the big changes are somewhere else. I think they are really in where we work, how cities are organized. And again, we don't understand exactly what will happen. But I think this is much more important than, again, we're going to see more robots, there's no question. But we were going to see them before COVID came, right? So yes, I would de-emphasize that.
Yeah. So you now, after a bit of diagnosis, we move to the policy response. You've been arguing in favor of shifting the government's fiscal stance by slowly, little by little, starting to withdraw some of the exceptional measures. What would be the horizon? We'll go into those specific measures that you propose changing, but if you had to now talk to governments, what would be the horizon to start withdrawing all these measures? Should we start doing it now, or over what period?
Okay. So here I'm going to go back to my 3 meters, 30 meters, 300 meters, 3 periods. Doing lockdown, and there was one priority, which was protection, right? Protection of workers, protection of firms. So we tried to freeze as much as we could. And the measures which were taken were basically designed to protect, nothing else, right? Avoid catastrophes. So we now, between now and the vaccine, again, between quotes, but the next year, year and a half, then I think we have to shift from protection to protection plus reallocation. And then, once the vaccine is there, then reallocation in the usual way. We're basically back to a world in which there has to be reallocation and we have to allow for it with a social safety net, but we're back to pre-COVID. So the intermediate period is what we should be focusing on now. It doesn't make any sense to make plans for 2025 with respect to that, right? So we have to think about what measures do we take now until this random time. We don't know exactly when we can basically be more relaxed. And here you want to move, but it's clear that the unemployment rate, when you include the partial unemployment and so on, is extremely high. So it's clear that when you put somebody in the unemployment pool, for many of these people, it's going to be really hard to find a job. Another way of saying this, it's totally useless if somebody somewhat productive in a job to put them into the unemployment pool, hoping that they'll find a better job. So I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is that, again, think of the two types of shocks. There are shocks which are going to go away, right? So do you take the shocks affecting restaurants again? It's a marvelous example because we can all think about it, right? Do you basically want to let them just all fail, only to have to recreate the restaurant industry in a year and a half, right? If we knew that the period was 10 years before we have a vaccine, then we would think, maybe we don't have restaurants. But here we're quite sure that we want them. And so we really don't want to let restaurants go down the drain. You don't want workers to get put into the unemployment pool, right? So I think you have to be very careful about moving from protection to reallocation. And you surely want to protect most of the sectors, or most of the firms in the sectors which are subject to this temporary shock so that they survive. And, when the vaccine is there, they're still there alive and they can grow again. So it's a mix. And so you have to think really hard about the measures that you want to put in place. Most governments are very much in that mode. I assume the Spanish government is as well. But on this, I've written, as you know, a piece with Thomas Philippon and Jean Pisani-Ferry, which I think gives the architecture of what can be done. So we can talk about this, obviously.
Yes. Before moving into that one, just one brief comment about the difference in the actions by the different governments. The move towards moving people towards unemployment insurance has been the preferred action by the U.S. government. It has kind of basically allowed everybody to be unemployed and then improve unemployment payments. Europe has opted for trying to preserve the structure in the way that you were suggesting. How would you compare the two reactions, and what's the explanation for such a big difference?
So I think you make a good point. I think that there's a clear difference between the US and Europe wins big time. So the approach of Europe was to look at what Germany had done, right, with corporate side, and then try to do the same. Namely, given that this was going to be a temporary shock for many firms, keep the link between the firm and the workers. So even if there was no work, somebody was de facto unemployed, right? He kept the link to the firm and he kept the contact, so it was easier to go back. And as a delivery vehicle, the idea of having the firms pay the workers and then be reimbursed by the state worked much better than if the state had to do it directly, because the firms know who they employ, right? So from an administrative point of view, the I don't know exactly what the success rate is, but at least in France, most of the people that were entitled to chômage partiel, to partial unemployment, got it in time, right? The US, I don't know why the US didn't adopt the German approach. In general, the US doesn't know too much about Europe, so maybe they just didn't know it existed. But they took a different approach at two margins, but with respect to workers, they basically said, well, the firms just separate and they lay off workers, and then the unemployment offices will do the job. And given that unemployment benefits are not very generous in many states in the US, it depends on which state you are. We're going to just put $600 more per person, no matter what. And it turned out that this totally overwhelmed the unemployment benefit system. Basically suddenly they had 10 times or 50 times the number of applications. And so it was a mess. And although the program was very generous, so if you got the money and you were the median worker, you actually got more than your previous income in general. But many people didn't receive it. And there was a backlash. I think part of the backlash against the lockdown came from that. So I think there was much more coherence and much better administrative delivery in Europe than in the US. I think there's a lesson here, which is when you have shocks which may go away, this notion that you keep the link between the firm and the worker is a good thing. It should not prevent the worker from looking at other jobs if other jobs are there. So if the unemployment rate is low, you keep your link, but you look around, and the firm may look around as well. But I think it's going to help a whole lot in this phase, in which, presumably workers are going, in part, to go back to firms. So in addition, going beyond administrative issues, in general, there has been much more coherence in the policies followed in Europe than in the US.
But as you were hinting in your previous answer, when we now move towards reallocation from insurance, it's good, we froze everything in place, everybody can continue attached. Now we have to start removing this safety net and potentially moving more towards the US system to some extent. How in particular with this Kurzarbeit, with these schemes helping workers, etc., how do we withdraw it in a way that doesn't freeze the economy in place, allows people to return to work? How would...
So I think the answer is straightforward, which is you keep the link as long as both sides want it, but you decrease the generosity of the benefits if you're on part-time work or in the partial unemployment system. So, what happened in France is that people received 84% of their net wage. And 84% of the net wage, if you don't have to go to work, if you don't have to take your car, and so on and so on, in many cases led some people just to relax and not show up even when asked. So that was too generous. It may have been, again, in real time, fine. But now it has been revised. And so I think you do that. You reduce it to the normal unemployment benefits that somebody who would be laid off would receive. So it gives incentives for the workers who are waiting to be called back but are not sure to basically look around. And if there's a job which pays 100% of the wage, they take it. So I see no reason to end it. I see good reasons to make the generosity of the benefits similar to the generosity of the benefits under the general system.
So that's on the side of the workers. Now the other side that has been very affected by policy has been the firms. Policymakers have been trying to keep firms liquid. They've been receiving big liquidity provisions and liquidity facilities to continue having access to cash. But of course, firms have accumulated a lot of debt, and it's increasingly going to be hard for many firms to remain solvent after all this debt accumulates. And you have indeed proposed a way out of this, which I think is really promising, and it would be fantastic to hear you explain how it could work.
Okay, so let me take one step back before we talk about restructuring itself. So the question is, so we talk about what you need to do for workers, and the essential theme is when the true unemployment rate is in the high 2 digits, you want to basically protect people, right? I mean, you want to give them some incentives, but you realize they're not all going to go back to work no matter what you do. On the firm side, what we have argued is that the right architecture has 3 components. So the first one is wage subsidies, right? You can think of what has happened to restaurants as a combination of a productivity shock, and they had less customers per space, and a demand shock in the sense that people may be very reluctant to go to restaurants for a while because of the lack of physical distancing, right? But these shocks are fairly big. I mean, the equivalent decrease in productivity in restaurants is probably of the order of 30% for a typical restaurant, right? Now, you know that that's there, and you also know that when the vaccine comes, and I keep doing quotes because we don't know exactly when it's going to happen, right? This productivity shock will go away. What do you want to do? Do you want to basically let the restaurant go bust because, it cannot cut the wage by 30%, I mean, just no way, right? Or do you want to basically allow it to survive as it would have in the absence of COVID, and be ready when the shock goes away? So I think the logic of this is that you want to give wage subsidies. And there are 2 ways of doing it. You force workers to accept cuts in wages, but that's not the way we do it in Europe, and not the way we should do it. Or you do wage subsidies, right? And so what we have pushed is that for the sectors which are suffering from productivity or demand shocks, which will go away, so not Airbus. Airbus is a different thing, right? That's a long run thing. But for the sectors where it's a question of a year and a half, okay, you give wage subsidies per worker, which allow the restaurant to survive, not thrive, but survive. Not all the restaurants, I mean, the ones which were in bad shape before, you're just offsetting the COVID shock, and if they were in trouble before, they're still in trouble. But you want to offset the COVID shock, in effect, right? And what we've argued is that sounds expensive, 30% of the wage, but we concluded that you have to do this for probably no more than 10% of the economy. And when you're successful, so that the wage subsidy avoids the firm closing, right? Then you pay the wage subsidy, but somebody would have been on unemployment is not. So you save 70% of the wage with a 30% wage subsidy, and the social contributions are another 50% because the person is working, not. So if you could target it perfectly, it's actually a money maker. In practice, it's not, right? But it's not an expensive program, and I think it's central, and I've been pushing various governments to think about it. Some of them, my own actually, has taken a measure which I like much less, which is to ask the firms to pay more, to contribute more to the wage paid to the people on partial unemployment. Right now, they don't pay anything, at least in France. Now they will have to pay some. So it gives them an incentive, indeed, to bring people back to employment, but it increases their cost. It doesn't solve the problem. Basically, makes it even harder to start. So you need the wage subsidy. So that's one, right? Then many small firms, I'm talking about SMEs, I think when talking about bigger firms, it's different, have indeed, as you said, liquidity issues. And, they had a few tens of thousands before, and they just don't have it. And they need loans just to go on, to pay the suppliers and so on and so on. And in the current context, if they go to a bank and they say, I need $50,000 or 50,000 euros to start and continue, they don't get it, because bank says, well, God knows what's going to happen at the macro level, and God knows what's going to happen at the micro level. So the evidence is, without guarantee, banks will not touch the stuff. And so liquidity issues become solvency issues, right? So there, it seems to me, the second component is to keep what most countries have put in place, which is partial guarantees to banks which make loans to firms, small SMEs, right? And what we know is the guarantee can't be 100% because then, banks will do anything, they will not care. But it cannot be zero. And it actually has to be very high. I mean, banks are, at least, again, in my home country, France, you need a very high level of guarantee for banks to be willing to do it. And even then, they're kind of a bit reluctant. So that's the second component. And I think it's essential to keep it. And again, it would be, I think over time, as things improve, you could decrease the degree of guarantee on the new loans. If things go well, if things go badly, you keep it. Same thing with wage subsidies, by the way. I think that if things improve and we find ways, even before the vaccine comes, to decrease the productivity shock, we can also decrease the wage subsidy. So these are the two. Basically, it's trying to protect the firms, the SMEs in particular, and the workers working there from the adverse shock, right? Which I think makes sense because the shock will go away, right? So, and then we get to what you were mentioning, which is even if you do all this, it's not going to work perfectly. You're not going to give wage subsidies to all the firms which need it. Some banks are going to say, go to hell, right? And so we're going to have a lot of bankruptcies. Now, we don't know how many, but some estimates we're going to have 2 or 3 times the rate of normal times, right? And that creates enormous problems, just administrative and otherwise. I mean, macro, clearly, if you don't do the right thing, then the legacy of the COVID crisis will be, a lot of bankruptcies, which are costly. And administrative, I mean, the existing system just cannot do the job. And so in that context, we thought about the role of the state. So if you want me to talk about this, I can stop for a second and you can, otherwise I keep going.
No. I think that's exactly the key question, which is how. I mean, it's clear what you're pointing out is very clear that our legal systems, our political systems would have everything. Administrative systems would have a lot of trouble coping, and also all these resources that are wasted in bankruptcy. So you do have a suggestion on how to minimize all these costs and make the process of eliminating this debt overhang faster and more efficient. And I would like very much to hear that.
So I start with a disclaimer. This is not a magic wand. Mm-hmm. It's still going to be a mess, but we can make it a bit less messy, maybe, right? And that focuses on the state. So the state, there are 2 aspects to the state as a creditor. The first is that it has an incentive to have less closings and more restructurings than the private sector would do on its own because of network effects, because of various externalities. If we just let the private sector do it, it's going to be too many bankruptcies, too many closings as opposed to restructurings, right? The other is that the state has zero expertise and zero knowledge of millions of SMEs, right? So the question is, what does it do? And so what we have said is, think of a simplified case where you have a bank with which the SME is dealing. So the bank knows something about the firm, and the other creditor is the state. How is it a creditor? Typically because of deferred taxes. Right, basically, a lot of what has been done has been to allow firms to defer taxes, or the partial guarantee to banks. So a typical SME is likely to have 2 main creditors: the bank and the state. And so, what can the state do? Well, it surely doesn't want to be involved in looking at the balance sheet of every single SME and say, you can pay or you cannot pay, right? So it has to find a way. And so, what we suggest is, the bank is given the following choice. So if you decide to close the firm, or going through the tribunal, so it's either a formal process or informal process, but if the end of the process is that the firm is closed, then the state will basically act with its existing creditor status. In many cases, it's a senior creditor. It's going to do, to use a technical term, it's going to do pari passu, right? It's going to say, I'm the senior creditor, the firm pay taxes first, and then if there's money, you get it, right? If you don't close the firm, but you're willing to take a haircut and restructure, then we'll be more generous. Whatever haircut you take, we'll take a bigger one, right? So the bank knows that if it takes a 30% haircut, the state will take a 50% haircut, right? So it's going to be a subsidy basically to the decision of restructuring rather than closing. So it's a very simple rule for the bank. The bank knows it has to choose a haircut, right? And it knows that if it chooses a haircut of X, the state will choose a haircut of X plus 20%. Or if it extends the duration of the repayments from 3 to 5 years, the state will extend it from 3 to 7 or whatever. And we have to think about the exact formula. But this, I think this has two good aspects. The first one is it simplifies, you have only one creditor in effect playing the game, the state just follows. And it will lead to less bankruptcies, closings. So again, it's still going to be a mess because my example is simple, but in practice, you're going to have many creditors beyond the bank. You're going to have suppliers. You're going to have various forms of credit and so on. But it will simplify it. And it seems to me that's a good direction. Let me, if I can continue, there's one more point, because there are many other schemes around. I mean, this is an issue that many of us, and I assume you yourself have been thinking about, which is, are there other ways? And there's another way, which is the state just gives up its claims, right? That's even simpler, but that's very expensive. And basically the state, or another way is the state becomes an equity holder. Now, how can it be an equity holder in a small firm? It just makes future tax payments, basically increases the tax rates on future profits. That's an equity position. So these are all fairly simple ways, but they cost a lot to the treasury. Ours cost, but much less. The state doesn't entirely give up its creditor status. But if you don't care about spending money, which I do, then there are even simpler ways. Okay, let's forget taxes.
So that just to have a short reflection from you on this last option. So the last option would be for larger firms which have an equity that is in the stock market. The state says, okay, I'll swap the debt for some equity position, maybe an equity position to avoid political games, an equity position which is the preferred equity or something that doesn't have voting rights. And for small firms, it says, I swap all the debt that you owe me for future taxes on profits. That how would this second? I mean, I think the first I can see working, but the second is a bit hard to imagine how to implement. Do you have thoughts on how to put it in place?
I mean, the question is at what rate? What equity claim do you get? I think you basically get an equity claim where in expected value, the additional taxes you'll get if the firm survives is equivalent to the debt or some haircut on the debt. Yeah, the equity position is just a way, it's in between what we said, which is, I think, as these things go, relatively straightforward. The other extreme, which is let's forget all the claims, right? It's in between, but being in between, kind of a shift from debt to equity is probably messy in terms of, what the terms of trade. Yes. Yeah. I mean, the centerpiece of what we push is not for the SMEs, is not an equity position. It is really just a way of getting things to go faster.
Yeah. I mean, I worry a little bit about, for example, in the European Union, we have a scheme which is called Solvency Support Instrument. The European Union is putting 25 billion next year, 5 billion this year, towards taking positions in firms, or well, guaranteeing equity positions through special purpose vehicles, etc. And part of the problem is, I mean, you can easily imagine how in many of these, economists call it incentive compatibility, right? Like how do we ensure that people are not kind of colluding or not making the taxpayer pick up money for, do you not worry, like it's a bit like the bailouts after the financial crisis, that we'll end up with losing a lot of legitimacy and people worrying that they're well connected and the people with friends are getting handouts from the state, etc., etc. How much do you worry about this kind of thing? I know the situation is extreme, so it's hard to avoid
for SMEs, I think the passive equity investor position is probably okay. You say, look, if we give up a claim, but your tax rate for the next 5 years is 3% higher. Okay, and they'll cheat on profits the way they always do, but you take this into account. Passive equity investor in larger firms, I think, creates all the problems that you've mentioned. And so I've been very specific about SMEs. But I think the issue is there because, again, they come in hundreds of thousands. When it comes to Airbus or Air France or Renault, this is a completely different game with all the issues that you have put in. Do we want the state to be a big equity holder, a bigger equity holder? Do we want it to be passive? Do we want it to be active? We get back into corporate finance in the usual way, and lobbying is going to play a role. And I'm struck at how generous the state is with Airbus, but maybe there are good reasons. Again, that becomes much more of a bargaining game between two entities, and then it's just a different world. At this stage, I very much worry about the small guys and girls, surviving until the sky is blue.
So let's now shift from little and from micro kind of issues, firms, etc., to monetary policies and inflation and all these issues. Basically, most economists believe, okay, we have a deflationary shock. There is little demand. There is going to be even less demand as people are worried potentially, etc. So most people think this big influx of financing from central banks is not very worrying from the perspective of generating eventually inflation. You have been one of the few people to warn, okay, most likely there will be low inflation or deflation continuously over the next few years, but there is a chance, probably small, but there is a chance of a high inflation, relatively high inflation on a very concrete scenario. Could you describe that scenario and how much should we be worried about it?
Yeah, so let me repeat. My expectation with most of the probability mass is on low inflation and having a hard time getting it there. But looking a few years out, so I've no, and this is nearly a probability 1 for the next few years, but thinking 5 years out or something like this, what worries me is, what is generically called fiscal dominance, right? Which is the following. As a result of what we're doing now, debt increases. It increases to, say, 150% or maybe 200% for all I know, and Japanese type numbers. But, things are fine. The interest rate remains very low. I think we can be fairly confident that it will be very low for some time. And so, the debt burden is not too high. It's fine. Now, suppose that for some reason, people become more optimistic. There are all kinds of opportunities for investment. Investment picks up. Aggregate demand becomes stronger, right? And we have potential overheating, which would be nice. And central banks say, well, we don't want to have overheating. We want to keep the economy at potential, but no more. And so we really should increase the interest rate, right? So in the jargon of macro, the neutral rate increases, which again, the markets give very little probability to over the next 5-10 years, but there's a distribution. And so then what happens? Well, say the Fed says, well, we really should go from 0% to maybe 3-4%, right? And then I think they get various phone calls. So the first one they get is from the then president. But if it's more than 4 years, I'm fairly confident it will not be Trump. But the president says, look, we have this debt burden, we have 150% debt. You're going to increase the rate by 400 basis points. Where do you think we're going to find the 6% or whatever, 7% increase as a ratio to GDP that we need to just sustain, keep the debt constant? And then what happens depends on the independence of the bank. I mean, the right answer from the central banker is, well, wrong number. But you can see how in some scenarios that could happen. The second is something we discussed together yesterday, if I may refer to this, which is they'll get phone calls from whoever has long bonds, namely the financial institutions. They'll say, do you want us to basically go bankrupt? I mean, we have these long bonds, now they're going to decrease in value enormously. And, so please don't do it, right? So there'll be pressure there, even if there's no pressure from the government. And then the last one, which relates to the size of the balance sheets of the central banks themselves, is that they have long bonds, a lot of long bonds in the asset side of their balance sheet, right? And they are going to say, well, if we do this, we basically, just create a very large loss on our holdings, and we're going to have to report a loss. And the last thing that a central banker wants to do is to report a loss. Now, you and I know that it doesn't much matter that there is a loss at the central bank. It's kind of irrelevant, but it's not irrelevant politically, which is if you have a government which doesn't like the central banker, the government will say, look, we nominated him or her, and look at what they did. We're bankrupt, right? So for all these reasons, there'll be pressure if and when the interest rate goes up. And then if the central bank gives up and doesn't increase rates, then you get overheating, then you get destabilization of expectations of inflation, and you can get hyperinflation. I mean, I don't think we will, but that's how it started. So this is the scenario, but again, let me put a 0.01 in front of it so that you can sleep at night. But we have to think about these things, and we're taking risks. I think we have to be very clear that, some people have taken my work as saying debt is utterly irrelevant. It's not. I mean, there's a level of debt at which one should worry. And it's higher than most people thought, but it's not infinity. The balance sheets of central banks imply that they're buying assets which are somewhat risky, and they're taking on risk. And central banks taking risk is okay, but it could come out as a loss. So, I think the priority is make sure that we protect as many of the businesses which need to be protected and the people. And that costs money, but we can do it. We have the space. But let's be careful.
If an Argentinian central banker or a Peruvian central banker calls you, which they probably do, and they ask you if they can do what the central banks in Europe and the US and Japan are doing, and just buy lots of assets from the government, basically even like England, the government directly borrowing money from the central bank, you'll tell them, well, if you do that, expectations are going to go wild, and inflation is going to start being a concern. What is the actual difference between those banks and the Federal Reserve? Is just history makes them credible, and there is some politics that doesn't worry us as much? And if that's just the difference, are the politics that different any longer?
Politics are different in the sense that even if you had a totally credible central banker and he can be removed at the stroke of a pen, then he's not credible. But I think you put your finger on it, which is credibility, which is, I think, what's happening in advanced economies is that as these balance sheets increase, expectations of inflation don't move, right? People think, well, there's no inflation. No, and it's still, I think the dynamics of inflation and of expectations of inflation in advanced economies are very much, well, the central bank has a target. Yes, we know it's not quite achieving it, but that's how we think. And if there was overheating, then it would go up a bit. And if there's underheating, it will go down. That's how people think. And the evidence on expectations is that. In other countries with different histories, people look at the balance sheet. People say, oh no, if they do this, then inflation is going to, and the very fact that they believe that makes it happen, right? So yeah, there's a sin. Past sins affect you very, very, very much. There's no question. So they don't have the room that the others have.
So let me finish with a hard question then. How do those equilibrium change? How do we go from equilibrium in which we kind of believe that the world is good and that, okay, inflation is not a concern? I mean, I know this is hard to answer, but how does the process in which people start to worry about it? And I think you wrote something in the 80s about wage price spirals. How do these things start? I mean, how does the society start to lose faith in a particular inflation target, in a particular framework? And are the kind of things that we see in the US, for example, with populism and all that? I mean, is this the kind of thing that can start that process?
I think it's a hard question, as you said, therefore I don't have the answer. But there are two aspects. Whereas in normal times, I mean, it's amazing how, despite the fact that we have undershot inflation for so long, before COVID, right? We were not at 2%. People just didn't care. My sense is not because it was credible, it's because it was so low that basically inflation is no longer salient. So I wrote something a few years ago on that. I think salience is really the issue, which is when I was a student in economics, the inflation rate was very high, nominal rates were very high, and we've thought about it all the time. Now people don't care. I mean, whether it's 1% or 1.5% or whatever. So they just don't think about it, which means that their expectations are basically a constant. And as long as it's like that, it's like that. What we don't know is how big the corridor is. So one of the objections to my 4% target for inflation, which I pushed a few years ago, which sounds good on paper because it would give more room for decreasing real rates, is that at 4%, it would become salient again. And it would make the job of the central banks much harder. So I think that's half. So I think in the environment in which we are in advanced economies, that's that. In countries which have a more checkered history or reputation, I think there the issue is different. There are two ways of thinking about inflation, kind of the one I just described, and one in which you basically take into account fiscal dominance from the start. And so anything the government or the central bank does, which indicates that they are perfectly happy with high inflation, and that may come from very different places. It's not the output gap which matters. It's the declaration. It's, who the Minister of Finance is. And then people can shift, and say, okay, I expect inflation because these guys are completely irresponsible. That shift is a kind of, again, a mind shift, right? The salience one was already a mind shift, if it's salient or not salient. But if it's salient, how do you form expectations? People don't think about the new Keynesian law when they form expectations. They say, well, no problem. Or we really have bad guys. And then I worry. And then I think it starts. So this is why it's very hard for some governments to achieve credibility. They come with a past.
Well, thanks very, very much. We've learned a lot. It's been really fascinating. And thanks for your time.
It has been fun.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I hope things move in the right direction and we can all
we can do this in 2 years when the world has nearly ended. Good.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Merci.
Bye, Luis. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Talk to you.
Bye.